Hi, and welcome to the Debrief on this Independence Day week. I'm Donna King. I'm editor-in-chief of the Carolina Journal. We hope you had lots of fun over the 4th, lots of flags, fireworks, cookouts. But we wanted to take this a little more serious turn and talk about, really dig into what we're seeing as a renaissance of free market liberty ideals. We've been covering a lot of these stories over the last year. I'm sure you've been following along with us, but we're really seeing this movement back toward free economy, back toward free speech. And I really hope that you'll stick with us through this. Like and subscribe here to the Debrief, because we're really going to have a great conversation today. I'm looking forward to it. Joining us here on the couches, of course, political reporter Alex Baltzegar. He's been covering the legislature for a long time and a lot of the stories we're talking about. And of course, from the John Locke Foundation, Mitch Kokai. Thank you guys for being here. And Brooke Medina from the John Locke Foundation as well. Going to be talking about some free markets. And Troy Kickler, new face here to the Debrief. Thanks for being here. Troy is running the North Carolina History Project. So he's got some interesting information about North Carolina's role in that Declaration of Independence. All right, let's kick this off. First up, protecting the First Amendment.
Hey, where's your ribbon?
Oh, I don't wear the ribbon.
You don't wear the ribbon? Aren't you against AIDS?
Yeah, I'm against AIDS. I mean, I'm walking, aren't I? Just don't wear the ribbon.
Who do you think you are?
Put the ribbon on.
Hey, Cedric, Bob, this guy won't wear a ribbon.
Who? Who doesn't want to wear the ribbon? Hey,
all right, well, so that was a little ahead of its time. I mean, that was like, what, the late 90s probably? You know, now I feel like we're seeing that, what's going on now. You probably were an infant when that ran the first time around, right, Alex?
Yeah, that's right. So before that scene there, he had refused to take the ribbon from the lady who was passing him out.
Right.
And then following that scene there, those guys take him into an alley and they beat him up for not wearing the ribbon.
Right.
So yeah, we are, that was a little bit ahead of its time in a sense, because we are seeing a lot more compelled speech and a lot more compelled actions in companies, these big companies who are, and some of that has to do with ESG, which is environmental social governance standards, which is actually sort of a market thing that's come into effect where some of these big companies are cramming down their typically left-leaning values onto companies in order to have them as a part of their stock portfolios.
Sure.
So that's been
Pushback
interesting.
on that, though, right?
We are seeing pushback on that, especially here in North Carolina. As many of you know, the state has its own investment fund, and they get to allocate resources, and a lot of that's a decision made by the state treasurer. But there was a bill this year to ban ESG considerations, basically, from the state investment portfolio. So there is some pushback from a state government standpoint. There was another bill that would have banned it from private investments, which there's probably some obvious problems with that. But as far as the state goes, the state will not, and that's something that was vetoed by the governor but overridden by the legislature. So that's something we won't have here in North Carolina.
Sure. And there was an issue with compelled speech. That was another bill that we've been following, where people would have to sign some sort of pledge when they apply to college or join a state government position and pledge their commitment to diversity and DEI principles.
Yeah, and in fact, the bill, basically, if you read the bill and not just hear the descriptions from the opponents, it basically said that if you're going to apply for a job in state government, you shouldn't be asked what you think about a current social issue, controversy, or major political debate of the time. That's not really something that should have anything to do with your state government job.
Right.
Once you work at a state government job and you're involved in training on this or that, the trainings shouldn't compel you to believe one of this list of 13 prescribed statements, all of which most people would see as kind of crazy. That you would be inherently racist or sexist based on your skin color, or that there is no such thing as the rule of law, or that the government of the United States should be violently overthrown, which was an old thought of in the communist days of the Stalin era. So there was some pushback on that, saying that, oh no, you're banning people from talking about important issues. No, that's not what the bill did. The bill said you're going to stop government agents from telling other people what they have to think and believe.
Right. And they're not allowed to take into consideration a person's political beliefs, and some of that can come in the interview process.
Right.
So they're not allowed to take that into consideration. But this is only dealing with state government. This is not saying that private businesses can't have certain outside requirements, like even stuff like political ideology.
Sure, sure.
But it is worth noting that the state government is the largest employer in the state, and so that can set sort of a precedent for other companies.
Right,
in the state, too.
But there's also a difference too. I mean, private actors generally can act privately, whereas the state government is acting on behalf of all of the people who are residents of the state and are paying taxes.
Sure.
And so there is a different standard. You want to allow the people who are acting on their own in private civil society to be doing other things that you wouldn't want your state government to do.
Very interesting. And Brooke, this is, I feel like that cultural trend is like boiling a lobster, right? You know, it's a little bit at a time until people, the next generation accepts it as a normal course of business. You and I have children growing up in this era. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is where you have kids that are growing up during a time where everything is recorded, everything's on screen.
Sure.
Oversharing is like the lingua franca of the time. It's just like, let's just share everything about our lives, which can, of course, then come back to bite them. And so there's these concerns about, you know, moments in time where people have such vehement, strong feelings about something, and then maybe they're asked to sign documents like this, and there's this whole record of maybe other thoughts or thoughts that are maybe fringe and aren't acceptable. They shouldn't even necessarily be accepted. But this whole notion of the importance of free speech and government not intervening and policing in this arena is just part of the American DNA. It's really, really important that we protect it for this next generation and show them this is worth fighting for, you guys. This is something that is of high value, and so it's good to see there are certain conversations happening at the legislature that are ensuring that we maintain and protect free speech.
Sure, sure. Troy, putting this in some historic context, you know, everything comes back around, and now we're seeing that fight for free speech happening even now in 2023.
Yes, it's happening now. One of the signers, North Carolina signers of the Declaration of Independence was really concerned about free speech.
Sure.
North Carolina was one of the, when the Constitution was submitted to the states to ratify, North Carolina didn't refuse the Constitution, but decided not to ratify it either because it didn't have a Bill of Rights.
Oh.
And you talk about the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights is freedom of speech.
Interesting. Yeah. So we talked earlier the difference between compelled speech and free speech. That sets up kind of an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, that's right. Compelled speech is interesting because there are certain instances where we have compelled speech in society, like when you're taking your oath of office for a job or you're signing off on a contract.
Sure.
But in a way that's still, you're still free to sign an agreement with somebody, right? Or you're still free to, you know, if you're running for office, you know ahead of time you're going to have to take this oath.
Sure, you've made the choice.
Exactly. So you've made a choice there, and that's different from other forms of compelled speech which are forced upon you.
Right, by government.
That's right.
Yeah, and you know, and that's something we were talking about also, limited government. I think it's important to note that, you know, now in 2023, we don't have to go back to quills and powdered wigs and all those things to see these freedoms and challenges happening, you know, speech, assembly. They've all been challenged even recently, right? You know, there was vetoes 3 years ago this week, July 3rd, 2020. We see that the governor vetoed 8 bills, including ones that would allow businesses to reopen in North Carolina. It seems like it 3 years ago has not been that long, but we saw that economic freedom really being held back. Mitch, you know, do you think that shutdown triggered our awareness, more awareness about limited government and rights to liberty?
I think it certainly did for some, because a lot of people were already focusing on these issues, knew they were important. But I think there were some people who probably thought, oh, you know, we're allowed to be free. You know, the government's not doing too much to stop what we're doing. And then the shutdowns related to the COVID-19 pandemic really changed that calculus. And people said, what, you're not going to let us have a 4th of July celebration? You're not going to let us gather with other people, more than 25 people at a time here and there? We can't get together and have any kind of meeting unless we're going to protest something we don't like the Republicans doing. That was, I think that was a shock to the system for a number of people, and it is something that's important to keep in mind, that we do have freedoms, but they are not set in stone and will never go away. We have to protect them. And each generation has to do that. It was one of those quotes from Ronald Reagan that preserving these liberties is something that every generation has to take up again and again. You can't just assume that the rights that we enjoy are going to be the rights that the next generation enjoys. You have to fight to protect them.
Sure. Now, what is limited government? That's something we talk about a lot, particularly around here.
Yeah, limited government or limited constitutional government in the case of the U.S., because we have a written constitution. It's important because some people might think limited government means small government. You just want lower taxes. You don't want government to do anything, and everyone wants to be a libertarian and let anarchy reign. Limited government is different. Limited government is saying government has certain roles that government should address, but it should stick to those roles.
Right.
Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be small. I mean, if one of government's key roles is protecting you from outside invasion or protecting people from committing crimes against each other,
right,
you might need to invest more money and time into police or into the military to protect you from other threats. But that's still part of limited government because you're focusing what government does on the things that only government can and should do, rather than having government do all these other things that should be left to the private sector and civil society.
Sure.
One of the things that we were talking about in coming up with this was the recent decision from the old outgoing state Supreme Court that had a 4-3 Democratic majority on the Leandro case, where they basically said, hey, it's okay for a judge who's in one branch of government to come in and force the executive branch to move money to deal with things that the judge thinks are important and bypass the General Assembly, which is supposed to be the agency that decides everything about the budget and where the money moves. And that's a key concern about separation of powers, which is also part of this idea of limited government. Government has certain things it has to do. It should stay in its own lane. When it gets outside of that lane, that tends to cause problems.
Sure. Alex, do you see a difference in philosophy when you're down at the General Assembly even today between the chambers or between the sides of the aisle?
Definitely. And back to the limited government idea,
Sure.
I think part of that is self-restraint, government imposing restraints on itself in its own establishment, which is exactly what we laid out in the U.S. Constitution. And then democracy is another way to check the government. And I think that's where some disagreement comes in between Democrats and Republicans about what they want to do once they are elected and what they're able to do under the Constitution.
Yeah.
And sometimes they try to do things that are not always constitutional, and then we have a check on that with the courts.
Right.
So
right.
it is interesting seeing the different beliefs and philosophies down there, for sure.
I think everybody wants what's best, but what they think is best is often really very different.
Exactly, and there's a lot of room to disagree about that,
Sure.
and that's why we have elections, and that's why we have the system
that's
that we have,
exactly
so
right.
that we can send people who disagree on stuff and figure it out.
Very interesting. Brooke, you and I have talked a lot about government and censorship and media and big tech and all of those things that we've seen since COVID shutdowns. There was a great cartoon out that showed having a censor right next door to the White House press office. We saw big tech really coming in and violating some of those rights, and we're only just now seeing the impact of it.
Yeah, that's the part that requires eternal vigilance, especially as it pertains to government job owning is what it's called. Social media companies or other companies, they apply this pressure, and there are, you wouldn't want to see an increase in regulations in your industry, right?
Yeah.
So, ergo, let me intervene. The social media companies then feel compelled to intervene and censor types of content on their sites because there's pressure coming from sometimes the Biden administration. We saw it also with the Trump administration, this pressure to police speech on these private companies. And then it is also, like I said, it requires eternal vigilance to ensure that these social media companies just do not get too cozy with government actors because, they have their own biases. They have their own preferences for who they want to see in the White House, and sometimes that ends up allowing for companies like maybe Meta or Twitter, whoever the case may be, to increase pressure on their preferred politician to create regulations that protect their power there in that part of the marketplace.
Sure, and they own the soapbox now, really.
Yeah, that's how people get their information.
And what's interesting there is for a long time, like I don't know how many years, I'm not going to put a number on it, but a while, these big social media platforms that basically had a monopoly on all of the social media, Facebook,
Sure.
Instagram, Twitter, whatever else, all of them did not really abide by free speech. They didn't have free speech standards themselves, and yet they were controlling the flow of speech
Right.
on their platforms. And it you know, that's a part where government intervention into that is tricky, because that's a free speech violation.
Yeah.
Right.
But what it took was Elon Musk buying Twitter at a premium, arguably,
Sure.
to break that sort of glass. But we were on a path to seeing heavy restrictions on free speech through a private
Right. Right.
measure like that.
Well, and I think it's important to note as well that social media is a type of consumer product, and so it's in their interest as a company to moderate the content that comes through there. I mean, you don't want a ton of smuck
Right.
going through and just populating your
It's a
feed.
fine line, right?
It is a fine line, but it is something that is best solved not by government, but by those companies, because their interest is in acquiring advertising dollars and making sure that they have companies that want to advertise on their platform. That's how they make money. And so that's the feedback loop that they need to be listening to, not that thumb of government putting its finger on the scale over there trying to dangle certain regulations in their face.
Sure. Troy, what are your thoughts on this?
This, well, the debate on limited government and what it is, you know, how big government should be, has been an ongoing debate even since the founding. Before there was the U.S. Constitution, there was the Articles of Confederation, so you
Right.
could say that was the first Constitution of the United States.
Sure.
There were some people who wanted to give more energy,
Okay.
is how they used the term. And
interesting.
go back to what Mitch was saying earlier about you know, protection from invasion. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no standing army.
Right.
You'd have to call on each governor,
Oh.
and they would provide the militia. They wanted a unified currency. Well, the Constitution did that. And Alex mentioned, and Mitch did too, about the three branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial.
Right.
But a lot of people forget about another separation of power. In the Constitution, federalism is a honeycomb
Okay.
throughout it. And that's another check, if you will, on
Explain that with
strong government.
federalism.
Federalism is, well, how shall I say this? Federalism allows states to be sandboxes, laboratories
Okay.
to experiment. Like let's say Massachusetts wants to have a state-run healthcare program. They can. North Carolina doesn't have to.
Right.
So, and then you watch what happens in Massachusetts. Does it work? Does it fail? Is it an okay idea? Can it be improved?
Sure.
That's right. So there's the three branches of government, but in the Constitution there's also the aspect of federalism.
Sure. So it's it's an art. It really is. It seems like it. Brooke, I'm going to come right back to you. One of the things we've been noticing is this real drive towards protecting the fruits of our labor and economic freedom. And North Carolina enjoys a lot of that. As our country does too, but not everybody does. Tell me what you've been seeing lately.
Yeah, so there's a new map that just came out from the Heritage Foundation that I think is really illuminating on this front, and it talks about freedom rankings all across the world globally. And as you can see, there's a lot of orange and red there. That's problematic. And what we are seeing, though, trends across the world, is that there is an increase in authoritarianism and a decrease in freedom trend-wise over the past decade and a half. That's hyper concerning, of course, and I think COVID certainly accelerated that. You mentioned the fruits of our labor. That is something that is in our Constitution that certainly garnered a lot of justifiable attention over COVID. And so what we have seen as that has receded, the COVID lockdowns and things like that, there is more of an awareness among the average North Carolinian as to what that means, and that they have those rights and they're incentived to protect them now, especially after seeing a lot of lockdown stuff that just, defied any sort of common sense.
Yes.
And And so I'm encouraged because there are parts of the General Assembly's sessions both this year and last year that advanced free markets. So there was the regulatory sandbox bill that got passed last year that specifically focused in fintech. To Troy's point about the test labs for liberty here in the U.S., Utah passed one first. We saw how that fared in Utah. It was met with great success, and so we passed one over here in North Carolina. Another one is a bill that just passed. It got signed into law. Or it passed without the governor's signature, actually, HB 130, and that's protecting energy sources here in North Carolina to ensure that certain municipalities and cities cannot ban certain types of energy. So we had a conversation over December about, are they coming for your gas stoves, the Biden administration's anti-fossil fuel, and this protects energy security so people can have the different types of energy they want. So those are some good directions that North Carolina is going that we're not necessarily seeing globally, but hopefully we can lead.
Yeah, of course. And Mitch, tell me what your thoughts are about this, because this is all about economic freedom, even in we get down to the minutia, things like who controls the energy sources and things like that.
Well, the fruits of your labor thing is very much of interest to me. That is written right in the North Carolina Constitution, and it is a provision that you don't see in the federal Constitution. All school kids know that we enjoy the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, the North Carolina Constitution has those, but sandwiched in between liberty and pursuit of happiness is the right to the enjoyments of the fruits of your own labor, which means that you're supposed to be able to work and keep what you get from working. And we've seen, because of COVID shutdowns, some additional attention to this idea of whether that is a violation of the rights to the fruits of your own labor. It's been part of several lawsuits that were part of the COVID shutdowns. It's been part of other lawsuits. There was the fired Durham police sergeant who tried to use that as part of his case to get his job back. And so there have also been some thoughts among newer members of our North Carolina Supreme Court that perhaps now is the time to ramp up the protections that are afforded because of that particular right. So I think that is another sign that we may be entering a new good era in terms of promoting freedoms and liberties and the protections that our founders and framers knew about.
Sure, sometimes it takes a pandemic and shut down. So you seeing that from lawmakers too?
Yeah, we're seeing some of that. You know, something that's interesting, and back to Brooke's point, internationally, we saw these COVID shutdowns lead to a decline in freedom across the world. And I was just thinking about this, like if our country did not have systems in place to counter that and fight back against the freedoms that were taken from us, where would we be at today? And I think that's true for a lot of countries across the world, is that they don't have those mechanisms to fight back against their government. So when government takes, it's not going to give it back. So I do think that's interesting. But yeah, our lawmakers, that's a couple of
and the emergency powers issue, that was the thing that was in the budget last year, right? Or it limits.
That's right. They put something into the budget last year, which you know, brought some people on board for some of the things in the budget. But yeah, they put this provision in there that limits the executive power of the governor specifically, and it spreads out the executive power into other members of the executive branch as well, like the Council of State.
So it puts limits on his ability to declare
because what we saw in the pandemic was that the executive of the executive branch was able to make decisions without any checks on him, using emergency powers.
And keep that emergency in place as long as he wanted. Because basically the new provisions say, if there's a hurricane that goes through, or some major storm, the governor can declare an emergency. The emergency's gone in a couple of days, no big deal. If it's an emergency that extends for a while, he's going to have to get the Council of State on board. For folks who don't know, that's the other executive branch officials who are elected statewide. And then if the emergency extends longer than a couple of weeks, few weeks, the General Assembly has to get involved. So that's 170 other people who have a closer tie to their communities. And that's a way to ensure that it's just not one person saying, there's an emergency, I declare it, and it's going to stay for as long as I want it to stay.
Right, because during that time, they just weren't having Council of State meetings, and that was one way they got around it, from what I remember. Yeah.
Right, and another thing was, there were times when the governor decided to consult with the Council of State, But then when they didn't say things that he liked to hear, he just bypassed them and said, well, I'm going to look at this other part of the state law and say that's the way that I get to do what I want to do without any input.
Sure. So Troy, this is, these mechanisms that Alex was just talking about,
Yeah.
they're really built into those founding documents. The Declaration of Independence, which we're of course celebrating this week. Do you think that was, something they were thinking about? They couldn't have been thinking about 2023 in a pandemic, but what was the goal when they were talking about doing this?
No, they wouldn't have thought about a pandemic. They wouldn't have thought about things like Facebook or Twitter,
Right.
or anything like that. But they were concerned. Again, there was a debate whether the government should have more energy or not.
Okay.
But by and large, they were mainly proponents, champions of limited
Right.
government. And go back to the point that I made earlier about things being honeycombed, federalism being honeycombed in there. And then I follow up on what Mitch said too about rights in the Constitution,
Sure.
and he talked about the state constitution. Many people forget that there is a state constitution, but they're longer than the national constitution, and there are more rights defined in state constitutions. And everything we do, whether we drive, our marriages, or work, whatever, the state constitution affects it.
Right.
And so people need to be aware of what's in the state.
So it's not just federal
Constitutional.
Constitution light. It lays out a completely different set of
No,
rights.
it's more specific, and that's why it's amended more frequently
Sure.
than the national
Very interesting.
Constitution.
Nobody knows about what's in the state constitution either. And there's actually a bill this session that it's civics oriented, and it requires students in public universities to learn about the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution. They have to read it in its entirety too.
Oh, interesting.
And the state constitution. They also have to read like MLK's letter from Birmingham jail, and I believe the Emancipation Proclamation from Abraham Lincoln.
I think that'd be really
I
beneficial.
think that'd be super beneficial for our North Carolina college students who are graduating, and most of them staying in North Carolina,
Sure.
learning about their state constitution.
Is there pushback on that? I can't imagine somebody would object to it.
So there's some interesting pushback because most Republicans like the bill.
Okay.
Democrats mostly don't like it,
Okay.
interestingly, but the main pushback that's causing a holdup is actually coming from the UNC system, who's a very powerful actor in the
Sure.
state, and they have a lobbying arm, or I guess they should.
Sure.
They act like lobbyists,
Right.
But they're really supposed to be government affairs. But yeah, they're against this bill because they think it infringes on the professors and the academia's right to control curriculum. Is sort of their argument. So they don't like
Interesting.
it, but that bill, we'll see what happens with it. It might move in the short session.
What to follow up with that too, the Locke Foundation back in January had a Watergate
Right.
event. Well, not a Watergate event, an
Right.
event to remember the events
Yeah, of course.
that happened at Watergate. And two of the panelists, Gene Boyce and Rufus Edmiston, in prepping for that event and interviewing those gentlemen, both looked at me and said the state constitution is very important and people need to be aware of it. And both basically, well, Gene Boyce in particular, in several cases that he had, it was the state constitution, the knowledge of the state constitution that was ultimately the outcome.
Oh, that's interesting.
those-
All right, so I'm going to come right back to you. We had 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence we're recognizing. Tell us a little bit about who those 3 were.
The 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence, the 3 signers from North Carolina, were William Hooper, John Penn, and Joseph Hughes. William Hooper was from the Wilmington area. He sacrificed a lot of his financial wealth for the Patriot cause. He was dragged through the streets one time, and that's one of the reasons why he moved to Hillsborough for his personal safety. John Penn was another signer of the Declaration of Independence. We know less about John Penn than we do about Hooper and Hughes, but Penn was an attorney from Granville County. Joseph Hughes was from Edenton. He was an entrepreneur, a businessman. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he had one of the largest rope walks in the what became the United States. It was 1/4 of a mile long, and this was essential. Edenton is a small town now, but back then it was a bustling port. So there would be a lot of ships, a lot of vessels out in the harbor, and it was not uncommon for people to do business with Joseph Hughes. And these ropes were very necessary for trade. They would be dropped into the ocean with the anchor when they came to port, and that's one example how the ropes were used. And so that was one of his entrepreneurial pursuits. But what is important, the antecedent to those 3 men signing the Declaration of Independence was what we call the Halifax Resolves.
Okay.
April 12th, 1776, and it's one of the dates that's on our current state flag.
Sure.
And at Halifax, the courthouse there, it was an 83-0 vote.
Okay.
Generally speaking, it empowered the delegates from North Carolina to negotiate with the delegates from other states.
Okay.
And it empowered them to sign something like the Declaration of Independence. They needed the state, provincial, or the state assembly to give them the okay to do so.
Sure, and we actually have Cultural Resources has been excavating the area around the courthouse in Halifax to look for some of those key important historic documents to learn more about it. But tell me about the Halifax Resolves, what it meant.
Well, Again, it empowered the delegates of the Continental Congress to sign a document such as the Declaration of Independence. And North Carolina was the first state, no matter what Virginia says, North Carolina was the first state that empowered the delegates to do that. And that's why on the license plates, you have "In God We Trust," "First in Flight," so forth, but there's also "First in Freedom." And that's where that phrase comes from. Is the Halifax Resolves. And what's interesting is even before the Declaration of Independence, there were localities such as Edenton that were declaring their independence from Great Britain.
Sure.
If you go to the Episcopal Church in Edenton, you'll see the test on the wall. It's a plaque. Well, the test is the vestry in that town declaring their independence.
Sure. So, Mitch, let me get your thoughts on this. For somebody to be willing to sign the Declaration of Independence then, it wasn't a simple signature. That was an act of bravery, of courage at that time.
I mean, basically, some would say it was treason.
Sure.
It didn't end up being treason because they won eventually, but if we had not secured independence for the North Carolina and the other colonies who were then united as a nation, they would have faced all kinds of serious negative consequences, including potential loss of life and all the loss of their property. So it took quite a bit to be able to go along with that.
Against the biggest superpower in the world at the time, too.
And for many of whom, this was their home country. They had grown up in the colonies, but they still thought, many of them, that Great Britain was the home country, and you were rebelling. It wasn't like it was a foreign invader and you were fighting them off like in World War II against the Nazis. For many people, this was the home country, and to be so aggrieved at what they did in Britain that you would go against them, that took quite a bit.
Absolutely. All right.
Well, and the founding really was steeped in Lockean ideals, which is what our organization is named after. John Locke Foundation is named after John Locke, who really challenged that divine right of kings. And so I think it really gave a lot of the founders the intellectual and philosophical onus to defy or to commit treason, because they felt like that treason, what Britain defined as treason, was really a violation of the natural rights of human beings, the rights to life, liberty, and property. So that's where it started at. And people own, first and foremost, themselves, the right to the fruits of their own labor, but also just who they are as people. And so I think that's a beautiful part of this, too, is just the Lockean thread that weaves through our founding.
Sure, absolutely.
And it was not an easy decision. Like some of the North Carolina founders, they wanted to stay with Great Britain until like 6 months before the Declaration of Independence. And another way to look at it, too, Brooke, is that some of the Americans were thinking that Britain was acting unconstitutionally. It was violating, not treason, but they were wanting to go. They were wanting their British rights, and so in a way, the Declaration of Independence was an effort to reclaim those rights, and that's why we have a written constitution and not an unwritten one like Britain had, because they wanted things to be in writing, sort of like a contract.
Sure, very interesting. Lots of food for thought. Thanks for joining us on this special edition of the Debrief, looking into the Declaration of Independence and limited government and all of these ideals that we're really seeing a renaissance in the last year, particularly since pandemic shutdowns. Thanks for joining us. Make sure you like and follow this video, and we'll come back to you every single week. Thanks so much.